Hello there, welcome back to my freshly rebranded channel and my ongoing attempt to review every single game ever on Steam Deck. If you haven't seen my last video where I took a look at all of the Ape Escape games running on the deck, essentially the goal of this series is to showcase the unique capabilities of handheld gaming PCs. To do that, we're going to test every single version of every single Ridge Racer game on the Steam Deck. For those of you that are new to the series, here's how it works. Via emulation, I test every port of each game released across consoles, handhelds and PC, and record footage of them via capture card. Based on my own subjective experience, I then give each game a compatibility score out of 10, and issue a final recommendation on which one you should play on Steam Deck. In order for a game to get top marks, it needs to run at its full, correct frame rate and feature no major graphical issues. Additionally, each port needs to render at the deck's native resolution. I'll also be giving each game a little teensy review as we go along. It's like a bonus, yeah? It's worth mentioning that these videos do take a lot of time to put together. With that in mind, I want them to be a service to you. If you like what I'm doing here, give the video a like and maybe even subscribe. I'd love to branch this series out to include other handheld PCs in the future, and I can only do that with your support. If you have a particular franchise you'd like to see tested on deck, pause the video and let me know in the comments. Next week's episode came directly from your suggestions, so keep them coming. Oh, and as always, I'll only be testing games through SteamOS, as that's what the vast majority of users are rocking on their deck. Alright, on to the games.
Ridge Racer!
8 months. That's how long it took Namco to develop the original Ridge Racer. Screeching into arcades in late 1993, its sole purpose was to challenge Sega's dominance in the arcade racing scene. To do that, Ridge Racer needed to launch before Sega's Daytona hit the arcades in early '94. This gave Namco just 8 months to deliver what is now considered to be one of the most important games to have ever graced a screen. And just look at it, isn't it beautiful? It's important to stress that games didn't look like this in 1993. Outside of a few notable exceptions, 3D gaming was still considered to be not totally there yet, a bit of a pipe dream. Ridge Racer played a crucial role in challenging that assumption. It dragged the arcade racing genre into the 90s, whilst also proving that 3D was here to stay. The game's lush visuals were a seamless upgrade to what Sega had been doing in the arcades up until then. Its focus on drifting around corners felt like a fresh and natural fit for the genre, and its soundtrack was a raver's dream. All of these factors came together to give Ridge Racer a cool factor that was missing from practically every other game in the arcade. 1 year later, in 1994, Ridge Racer would be the very first title certified for the PlayStation 1's launch. This would mark the beginning of a long-standing tradition, Sony consoles launching with a Ridge Racer game, a custom that would last all the way up until the PS Vita's launch in 2012. I adore this game, I adore this franchise, and I can't say enough good things about it. Which is why I'm going to start our testing on deck by saying some not good things about it. Despite the objective brilliance of Ridge Racer's inaugural entry, its arcade iteration makes an unfortunate transition over to the Steam Deck. For reference, to run the game we're using the most up-to-date version of MAME available within emudeck. From the off, MAME's overall goal of accuracy prevents us from being able to upscale 3D graphics effectively, so in this case we're stuck with the same 640x480 resolution that the original arcade version utilised. This isn't a deal breaker, but it's definitely compounded by Ridge Racer's poor compatibility within MAME. Frame rates routinely tumble from the game's 60 FPS target, putting a noticeable barrier between you and the action on screen. Controls and audio are okay, but the substandard level of performance prevents me from earnestly recommending the arcade version of Ridge Racer on deck. Dodgy performance and a lack of easily customizable display options tarnished this version of Ridge Racer, resulting in a compatibility score of 6 out of 10 on Steam Deck. Switching gears over to the PS1 version of Ridge Racer, and we're running the game within DUCKSTATION, installed once again via emudeck. To cut to the chase, Ridge Racer's PS1 version runs absolutely beautifully on the deck. The only issue I witnessed was the UI and skybox warping and glitching out like crazy as I took part in my first race. Switching off PGXP texture correction within DUCKSTATION, however, and the issue is completely resolved. This leaves us with a stellar version of the original Ridge Racer. Performance is nigh on flawless, controls and audio are great, I genuinely can't fault it. Thanks to the PS1 version's excellent showing on deck when played via DUCKSTATION, this is an easy recommendation for me. Ridge Racer for the PS1 scores a compatibility rating of 10 out of 10 on Steam Deck. Here's a fun curio for you. In 1999, 6 years after Ridge Racer's initial launch, Namco let loose another version of the game, titled Ridge Racer Turbo. This curated blast from the past was bundled in with Ridge Racer Type 4, and it showcased the advancements Namco had made in programming for the PS1. Whereas the original Ridge Racer ran at a stable 30 frames per second, Ridge Racer Turbo zips by at a full 60 FPS. Beware the caveats, however. Ridge Racer Turbo only contains one track, one car, and a one-on-one race. In order to achieve that silky smooth refresh rate, sacrifices had to be made to the frame time deities. Feeding this bonus disc through DUCKSTATION on the deck, and we get to experience the full impact of the game's performance uptick. The frame rate is locked at a stable 60 FPS, and just like the original game, it looks and sounds phenomenal. Ridge Racer Turbo excels on the deck and stands as a fun little aside for the series. The game scores a compatibility rating of 10 out of 10 on steamdeck. And with that, we've tested each and every version of the original Ridge Racer on steamdeck. It's always a treat to revisit the original entry in each franchise that we look at for this show, and this time is no exception. Ridge Racer was the creation of a new dynasty for Namco, and the games that followed this one would define the arcade racing genre throughout the 90s and noughties. Here's a recap of the scores, and it seems we have a tiebreaker on our hands. In a first for the series, I'm going to award the title to both iterations of Ridge Racer on the PS1. Play both of them, or I'll get you. The PlayStation 1 couldn't be here to accept its award today, however it has asked us to thank both the Polystation and the GS5 on its behalf. Good stuff.
Ridge Racer 2! We're ready and waiting for you. Come on, pull up to the starting line and rev your engine.
By June of 1994, fans of Ridge Racer were only just getting around to scooping their jaws up off of the floor. The white-knuckle 3D escapades of the original game were now being mirrored in other games made by other companies. Namco weren't having any of that, releasing Ridge Racer 2 just 9 months after the original game's launch. To be fair, Ridge Racer 2 is more or less an update to the original game, as opposed to a flat-out sequel. Improvements were made to the game's visuals, some new music tracks were added, however, the marquee feature of Ridge Racer 2 was multiplayer. 8 cabinets could be networked together for what I can only imagine was a truly special experience. Outside of these changes and improvements, actual headline alterations were thin on the ground. We wouldn't see those until later in the series. Despite this, critics and fans alike flocked to Ridge Racer 2, and they loved every bit of it, new and old. Checking the sequel out on deck, and we find ourselves withheld from the game's key feature, multiplayer. Outside of that, we still get to enjoy all of the quality of life improvements made to Ridge Racer 2. The game looks nicer, sounds better, and remarkably runs smoother on deck than its predecessor. It still isn't perfect, and I did experience frequent performance dips throughout my time with the game. It's just that those dips had less of an impact this time around. Thankfully, they were milder and less significant than they were in the original Ridge Racer. Ridge Racer 2 on MAME on deck offers up a respectable albeit imperfect experience. Visuals, controls and audio are all positive points for this sequel. However, performance still leaves a little to be desired. Whilst it fails to achieve a perfect result, Ridge Racer 2 scores a not too shabby 7 out of 10 for compatibility on steamdeck.
RACER!
Following on from 2 immensely successful arcade games and 1 home console smash, Namco had zero intention of resting on their laurels. In July of 1995, RACER was released into arcades, and this was the biggest entry in the series yet. By today's standards, RACER is positively anemic. However, it's a bounty in comparison to the series' first 2 games. Instead of 2 courses, we now get to race through 4, and they all look gorgeous. There's a brand new suite of cars to drive, and the handling model has been completely overhauled for this sequel. Last but certainly not least, there's also an entirely new soundtrack, and trust me when I say it's the best we've heard yet. RACER was another smash hit for Namco's arcade division, going on to be the highest grossing dedicated arcade game of 1996 in Japan. Clearly, Ridge Racer was here to stay, and the industry was better off for it. Jumping into RACER on steamdeck, and we're unfortunately back in This Ain't It territory. We're once again using the latest version of MAME, and compatibility leaves a lot to be desired. The game's visuals are about the only thing that has transferred to the deck relatively unscathed, even if they aren't being displayed at the handheld's native resolution. Beyond that, performance is somewhat lackluster, with frame rates constantly fluctuating throughout each race I took part in. This had a knock-on effect on the game's audio, which was crackling so bad at points that I thought there was a ghost behind me, frying a ghost egg. It's unfortunate that Rave Racer only ever existed in the arcade, as it means it's the only version we get to emulate on deck. Thanks to its poor performance and pissy audio, the game scores a compatibility rating of 5 out of 10 on Steam Deck. Now, you'd think that releasing 4 games across the span of 2.5 years would be enough for Namco. Hardly. In May of 1996, the company sought to reassert Ridge Racer's might on home consoles by launching Ridge Racer Revolution for the PS1. Instead of porting over Ridge Racer 2 or the smash hit Rave Racer, Namco opted to develop a Franken-sequel for Sony's machine, pulling in elements from each and every arcade game in the process. Revolution's handling model draws heavy inspiration from Ridge Racer 2, as does its soundtrack. The game's UI and presentation, however, they feel more in line with Rave Racer. Whilst the game was well reviewed on the whole, several critics noted that driving the same cars around the same few tracks was becoming a little tiresome. The home console space was moving on, games were getting bigger and more value oriented, and following Ridge Racer Revolution, Namco would need to dig deep when designing a sequel. Despite how critics may have felt at the time, I can assure you that Ridge Racer Revolution is still a lot of fun to play, especially on the Steam Deck. We're running the game via DUCKSTATION and using the recommended settings down in the description for this one. Right from the get-go, the performance, controls and audio are a very close match for original PS1 hardware, albeit with the benefit of being upscaled to the deck's native resolution. There's very little that I can criticise about the emulation here. The entire experience transfers well to Valve's machine, serving as an excellent way to play this pseudo-sequel in all its glory. Ridge Racer Revolution on Steam Deck scores a compatibility rating of 10 out of 10.
Rage Racer.
Given just how far console racers had advanced in just a few short years, Namco would once again need to innovate if they wanted the Ridge Racer series to maintain its relevance. And innovate they did, with Rage Racer releasing for the PS1 in 1997. Aside from the name, Rage Racer's biggest departure from series norms is found in its overall structure, which has you racing through a set of increasingly more difficult Grand Prix events and upgrading your vehicles as you go. This was a huge departure for the series, which, up until that point, had been operating solely as a traditional round-based arcade racer. Namco's willingness to embrace emerging trends in the console space results in a much more replayable game overall, and improvements made to the game's handling and visuals provide existing fans with more than enough reasons to return. Rage Racer is an absolutely essential entry in the franchise, and I'd easily recommend that you play it even today. And what better way to indulge in a bit of rage racing than in DUCKSTATION on your Steam Deck? Given just how positively DUCKSTATION has continued to show up on deck, it should come as no surprise that Rage Racer is another excellent bit of emulation. The only issue I need to mention is that PGXP texture correction has a tendency to make the skybox go all wiggly. Turning that feature off completely resolves the problem, however. Even though you're probably looking at this footage and thinking to yourself, has this lad ever played a Ridge Racer game before? I can assure you that the changes made to the game's handling in particular map over well to the deck's controls. I'm just playing the game through the preview window of my capture card, so yeah, that's my excuse, okay? Excellent performance, phenomenal visuals and responsive controls make this another clear win for DUCKSTATION on deck. Rage Racer scores a compatibility rating of 10 out of 10 on Steam Deck. Can you even call yourself a 90s gaming franchise if you don't feature a spin-off intended for kids? In what could only be considered a rite of passage for the Ridge Racer series, Pocket Racer was released exclusively in Japan and exclusively in arcades in 1996. The game essentially takes the original Ridge Racer and squishes its vehicles down to comedic proportions. That's it. That's Pocket Racer. It features the same 2 courses as the original game, the same music, there's literally nothing else setting it apart from Ridge Racer. It even features the same scantily clad grid girl as the original, which, in this context, is interesting. In order to play this game on the Steam Deck, we once again need to rely on MAME, as Pocket Racer was only ever available in arcades. We're running the game in 640 by 480 resolution, just like the original cab, and as you've probably guessed by now, performance is unfortunately still quite bad. The entire Ridge Racer series suffers from rather poor compatibility in MAME, and this spin-off is no exception. The visuals look rather rough on the deck screen, the frame rate has a tendency to dip and dive, about the only thing I can comfortably praise is the game's audio, which comes across to MAME on deck without any major snafus. Man cannot live on sound alone, however. Dodgy frame rates and poor presentation stifle Pocket Racer within MAME on deck. For that, the game scores a compatibility rating of 6 out of 10.
R4.
You know those games that feel like a comfort blanket? The type of experience that you can revisit every year or so, where playing it feels like coming home? For me, the Ridge Racer series contains 2 of those games, and one of them is Ridge Racer Type 4. Released in 1999, R4, as it's commonly stylized, was the franchise's PS1 swansong. Structurally, it takes just enough from its predecessors, whilst striking out on its own and ramping up the accessibility, polish and beauty. I honestly think that Ridge Racer Type 4 is one of the most artistically accomplished games ever produced. The entire tone of the game feels so hyper-specific to my tastes that it's honestly difficult for me to eulogize it. The menu design, the colour palette, trackside details, vehicle designs, the music, it feels like it could only have come out of Japan at the end of the 90s, and the game is all the better for it. When it comes to mechanics, we're in familiar territory here. There's just as much of a focus on drifting and learning the flow of the course as there was in earlier games. This time, however, there's a decent helping of what I can only describe as readability in R4's mechanics. The drifting and handling doesn't feel realistic, and it doesn't feel like any other game. However, it's comprehensible. It takes time to learn, it's reliably satisfying, and it underpins the entire game. Now, I'll be honest, I could wax lyrical about R4 for weeks, but we need to crack on. Thankfully, playing the game on deck is an absolutely sublime experience. DUCKSTATION continues to knock it out of the park in just about every metric, and I'm grateful that one of my favourite games fares so well within the emulator. Performance is flawless, audio is near perfect, and the game's unique handling is relayed brilliantly thanks to responsive and tactile controls. I did notice that the PGXP texture correction feature within DUCKSTATION made the speedometer glitch out on very rare occasions. However, I opted to leave it switched on, as I feel it really allows R4's art to shine. It's going to come as no surprise then that Ridge Racer Type 4 gets a positive rating on steamdeck. My eternal bias aside, DUCKSTATION's might as an emulator means that R4 gets a compatibility rating of 10 out of 10 on steamdeck. Play it! If you've been following the platforms we've been emulating on the deck so far, then you might be under the assumption that there was some kind of exclusivity clause between Namco and Sony when it came to Ridge Racer titles. However, there wasn't. Despite the companies sharing strong ties with one another, Namco was more than happy to bring Ridge Racer to other platforms. Enter Ridge Racer 64 for the Nintendo 64. Released in the year 2000, Ridge Racer 64 is the first game in the series that wasn't actually developed by Namco. Instead, the game was put together by Nintendo's own software technology division. This relatively new US-based dev team had been put together by Nintendo a couple of years earlier, with the express goal of making games for Western audiences. The Ridge Racer game that emerged from this weird partnership is a strange beast. Stylistically, it looks like someone made the game after having had the first couple of Ridge Racer games described to them over lunch. Mechanically, it plays like a noticeably rougher version of Ridge Racer Type 4. However, it does run at a full 60 frames per second, which I respect. Hopping over to our Steam Deck for some testing, and we mark the N64's first appearance on the show. Welcome N64, take your shoes off on the way in. To play the game, we're using a relatively new addition to emudeck's suite of emulators, Rosalie's Mupen64 GUI. The Mupen64 emulator has been around for a while. What Rosalie has done is produce a slick graphical interface that's very reminiscent of RPCS3 or DOLPHIN. It's a fantastic bit of work, and it makes getting up and running with N64 emulation on deck an absolute breeze. No RetroArch required. As for how the game performs on deck, we do get some shader compilation stutter throughout the first 10 minutes or so. After that, however, frame rates are as smooth as a nice hot mug of piss. The N64's visuals upscale really nicely to the deck's screen. Whether or not you like the look of the game itself is a matter of personal taste, of course. The N64's lack of optical media and its reliance on ye old cartridges means that Ridge Racer's iconic soundscape has been somewhat muted for this entry. The few musical tracks that remain have indeed survived in their jump to the deck, however. With all of that said, Rosalie's Mupen 64 GUI puts forward a very strong first showing for the N64 on our show. Ridge Racer 64's smooth performance, sharp visuals and accurate audio bumped the game up in our ratings, with only some initial shader compilation stutter keeping the game away from a perfect score. Ridge Racer 64 on deck scores a compatibility rating of 9 out of 10. Now this might come as a surprise to you, but not only did Nintendo make their very own Ridge Racer game for the N64, but they actually made the same game twice, revisiting it in 2005 for the DS. Despite some surface level changes to the game's UI and presentation, it's essentially the same game as the N64 version. As for how the game transitions over to the deck, I'd say it's average. By its nature, the DS version of the game looks and plays worse than the N64 port, and this dip in quality is faithfully reproduced on the deck. Performance is wobbly, however, with frame times often jumping around enough to make the experience feel really unresponsive. The audio is slightly crackly too, which could just be a result of this being a DS game. Taking all the pros and cons into account for this one, and Ridge Racer DS gets a compatibility score of 7 out of 10 on Steam Deck. And there we go, both versions of Ridge Racer 64 tested on deck. Here are the scores as a recap, and the N64 version of the game takes the award. The N64 couldn't be here today to accept its award, but it has asked us to thank both the 64DD and Low Poly Judi Dench on its behalf. Excellent.
Ridge Racer 5.
There's no need to overdo.
Just 1 year after Namco made masterful use of the PS1 with Ridge Racer Type 4 and practically defined its autumnal years, the publisher went on to release a full follow-up for the PS2's launch. Ridge Racer 5 launched in tandem with Sony's new console throughout the year 2000 in Japan, Europe and the US. I'm aware I keep saying this on the show, but I am stunned that a game with this level of polish, refinement and originality was released just 1 year after its predecessor. Ridge Racer 5 takes the series' focus on high-speed drifting and complements it with a handling model that feels heavier and more realistic than in prior games. It's more challenging to get to grips with, but it's just as satisfying as before. Launching into a brand new console generation, of course the game looks phenomenal, and it was certainly an early showcase for the PS2's strengths. It rolls by at a smooth 60 FPS on real PS2 hardware, however, it does look very jagged thanks to the game's use of a technique called field rendering. This essentially means that the game renders alternating sets of scan lines each consecutive frame. The benefit is really smooth performance, but the drawback is feeling like you're looking at the game through a set of Venetian blinds. When it comes to playing the game on deck, well, I have good news and bad news. The good news is that Ridge Racer 5's performance and visuals have improved dramatically in recent years. This is thanks in part to PCSX2's new VULKAN renderer, and some targeted overall optimizations. The bad news is that it still isn't perfect, especially on Steam Deck. The first problem you'll notice is performance. Regardless of whether SMT is on or off, the game's pre-race flyovers and intro cutscenes stutter dramatically. Frame rates get so bad that the audio track of the game's opening movie ends up restarting over the end of the cutscene, thanks to the video falling out of sync with the audio. Once you're actually in a race, however, performance improves dramatically. Frame pacing can be poor at times, but the in-game frame rate does settle somewhere between a respectable 55 and 60 frames per second. The second area in which you're likely to spot problems is the game's visuals, which leave a little to be desired. To be clear, these problems are nowhere near as severe as they used to be. Recent updates have downgraded them from totally immersion breaking to noticeably annoying. It's the car bodies. You'll notice that any shadowed area on any vehicle looks as though it's bathed in TV static. It isn't game breaking by any means, but it is worth mentioning. In addition, certain trackside elements will flicker relentlessly, which is slightly more distracting in my opinion. The biggest issue I had with Ridge Racer 5, however, was getting its controls working. By default, the game seems to think that you're using a PS1 controller, despite having the controller set to mimic a DualShock within PCSX2's settings. The problem here is that Ridge Racer defaults the analog button on real PS2 controllers to off, meaning you gotta press that button or else you're stuck using the D-pad. Easier said than done, as emudeck's default configuration for Steam Deck has the analog button set to something called SDL Guide. That ain't a button. My workaround here was to use Steam's Input Manager to create a new radial menu on the left touchpad, to which I added a button that represented A on a regular keyboard. Then I accessed PPSSPP's controller settings, clicked the analog button's binding, and pressed the radial menu's A button to set things right. Back in the game, and pressing the radial menu's A button switched analog controls on, and I was finally able to play the game properly. Taking all of the pros and cons into account, and it's difficult to fully recommend Ridge Racer 5 on deck, thanks mostly to its poor compatibility within PCSX2. Controller issues, pissy performance and wonky visuals furnished this game with a 6 out of 10 compatibility rating on Steam Deck. Just so you know, there was also a version of Ridge Racer 5 released in the arcade 1 year after the PS2 version in 2001. I've checked and there is no way to play this port on Steam Deck or in MAME. As such, it gets a 0 out of 10. Good luck to you. Which one to recommend? Tentatively, I'm going to back the PS2 version of Ridge 5 on deck. Play that one. Thanks to the game not scoring very well on PS2 to begin with, this version also wins the episode's shittest victory trophy. Well done, Sony pal. After a healthy dose of mainline entries, we're venturing back into spin-off land with 2003's Racing Evolution, a sim racer released across Xbox, PS2 and GameCube. I'm not entirely sure why Namco opted to put the brakes on any new mainline games in the series following on from Ridge Racer 5, but this is the closest thing we got on home consoles until 2005. And let me tell you, it ain't close at all. About the only thing reminiscent of Ridge Racer in Racing is its soundtrack, which is excellent. But even that feels at odds with the game's sedate, sim-like nature. How Namco considered themselves capable of going toe-to-toe with platform-exclusive sims like Gran Turismo is beyond me, but there was an attempt. Ultimately, the game is just boring to play, its brake assist is laughably strong, there's little sense of speed, ever, and the handling feels squirmy and unrealistic. Considerable effort was put into the game's presentation. There's an actual story with cutscenes, which is amazing, and the radio chatter during races from rivals in your pit crew is cute and charming. Nevertheless, this isn't enough to save the game. It reviewed poorly at the time, and it's utterly non-essential today, which is great because I have 3 versions to test. Starting off with the GameCube port being played via DOLPHIN, and I'm reminded of how relieved I was not to use DOLPHIN in our last episode. Once again, I see a DOLPHIN game plagued with frame pacing issues. Despite the emulator spitting out 30 frames per second, those frames are distributed very poorly, which leads to a constantly sluggish and stuttery experience. I've said it before and I'm sure I'll say it again, but it's difficult to tell where the problems lie with DOLPHIN on Steam Deck. Valve's upcoming SteamOS 3.5 update apparently contains some SMT related fixes, which could potentially have a positive impact on DOLPHIN's performance. Until then though, we gotta rough it out. Thanks to its god-awful frame pacing, Racing Evolution on Steam Deck gets a compatibility rating of 7 out of 10. Hopping over to the Xbox, and we're trying the game out within Zemu, installed via emudeck. Even with my recommended settings, you'll find those in the description by the way, the game runs terribly and looks awful. My vehicle was perpetually dark, cutscenes ran at about 5 frames per second, and the entire game was operating in slow motion with frame drops. I can certainly classify this version of the game as being completely unplayable, regardless of how committed you might be to playing the Xbox port of Racing Evolution. An absolute smorgasbord of technical issues results in the Xbox version of the game scoring a compatibility rating of 3 out of 10 on Steam Deck. Rounding out this trio of middling sim racers is Racing for the PS2, being played once again via PCSX2. Honestly, I expected this version to perform the best out of the 3, but it's essentially a wash between this and the GameCube port within DOLPHIN. Frame pacing is just as bad in this instance, only now you have the additional controller latency that PCSX2 suffers from, compounding the game's ropey handling even further. I will admit that the game looks a bit nicer than the GameCube port overall, but that's more a matter of personal taste. On balance, I'm going to have to give the PS2 version of the game a compatibility rating of 6 out of 10 on deck. Well, I'm certainly glad that's out of the way. All 3 versions of Racing Evolution put through their paces on deck. Here's a recap of the scores for you, and DOLPHIN takes the cake. Despite the emulator edging me closer to a nervous breakdown on the daily, the GameCube version wins the day. F*** you, DOLPHIN.
Ridge Racer.
Remember earlier in the video when I said there was one more game in the Ridge Racer series that held comfort blanket status for me? Well, Ridge Racer, or rather its sequel, is that game. Bear with me on this, it's a little convoluted. In 2005, Namco released Ridge Racer as a launch title for the PSP. This wasn't the original Ridge Racer, however. This game is a best-of compilation featuring loads of tracks from older games and a suite of new vehicles. To make things more complicated, Namco then released Ridge Racer 2 for the PSP a year later. This isn't related to the arcade game of the same name. Instead, it's essentially the same game as the first Ridge Racer on PSP, but with more content. Got it? Despite the fact that PSP's Ridge Racer 2 was derided by critics for being a thinly veiled content pack, that's the game we're looking at. Does that make sense? Anyway, regardless, I absolutely love both of these games. Ridge Racer 1 was the first game I ever saw running on a PSP, and to say I was blown away would be an understatement. By the time I was able to get a hold of the game myself, Ridge Racer 2 was out in the wild, which was everything the first game was but more, and I loved it. Mechanically, these Ridge Racer titles are a little controversial, as they replaced the series' drifting mechanics with something known colloquially as the auto drift system. Essentially, when you begin drifting in these games, your car locks into an invisible track that follows the curvature of the corner. Instead of the focus being on how well you can maintain a drift's trajectory, it's now almost entirely centered on how effectively you enter and exit the drift itself. It's a difficult system to explain, you'd need to get your hands on it and get a feel for it. And whilst it is very different from earlier games, I still really enjoy it. It's supremely satisfying to enter and exit drifts at just the right time, defying physics and absolutely whipping through corners. Given the fact that I play through Ridge Racer 2 on PSP probably once every year and a half, I feel like I'm in a good position to critique the compatibility of these games. The footage you're seeing is from Ridge Racer 2 within PPSSPP, however I did test both games. As I mentioned previously, both titles are essentially identical, aside from the tracks and cars included. I gotta say, I'm really disappointed with how these games run on deck. For starters, each game's opening cutscenes are clipped off right before they end, which is a minor gripe, but it's really jarring nonetheless. The real issues begin to pile up once you're in-game, with the performance in particular leaving a lot to be desired. The games seem to have a really hard time pinning themselves to that 60 FPS limit, with the frame pacing jumping around in a manner similar to the way DOLPHIN performs on deck. I did notice that these issues seemed to occur at the same points during each lap, so there's a potential point of origin for any aspiring debuggers out there. Outside of that, I did notice some visual issues that seem to be a new regression for these games within PPSSPP. You'll see from the footage on screen that it looks like these vertical lens flares are piercing through the environment and trailing across your view, which is weird. Taking everything into account, I'm really disappointed that these games aren't an absolute slam dunk on deck. Thanks to the lackluster performance, crippled cutscenes and graphical glitches, Ridge Racer 1 and 2 score a compatibility rating of 7 out of 10 on steamdeck.
Ridge Racer.
Given that the PSP's Ridge Racer games had established a solid and well-received framework for the series, Namco opted to iterate rather than innovate for their next attempt at a mainline game. In 2005, Namco released Ridge Racer 6 as a launch title for the Xbox 360. That's right, Team Green managed to snatch away one of Sony's launch title mainstays, at least for now. The similarities between Ridge Racer 6 and Ridge Racer on the PSP run deep. The handling model is nearly identical between the two games, which, depending on your taste, may or may not be a good thing. For me, I really like it. Screaming around corners like a possessed Scale X trick is still really fun. The corners themselves, though, well, they're a little less compelling this time around. Ridge Racer on the PSP was a tough act to follow, given that it included the best tracks from every game in the series. Ridge Racer 6, on the other hand, solely consists of brand new tracks, and to be honest, they just aren't as engaging to drive around. Graphically, they're a lot duller than in past games, and their layouts feel overly forgiving. There are very few super challenging sections that test your grasp of the mechanics. Ridge Racer 6 was a respectable reiteration of the franchise's core appeal. It didn't break new ground in the same way the series had done in the past, but as fans, we were happy enough with what we got. If we want to play the game on Steam Deck, then we have to use Xenia, which is the most work-in-progress emulator currently packaged in with emudeck. Booting the game up and we see the opening cutscene. Looks a bit screen-teary, but yeah, everything's good so far. Menus are looking good. Tight, that's tight. Getting into the game and... oh, I see. Much like Burnout Paradise a couple of episodes ago, we're stuck in Tron vision. Ridge Racer 6 does boot up on deck, which is saying something, we just can't actually play it. For that, the game scores a compatibility rating of 2 out of 10 on Steam Deck.
Ridge Racer.
In what could potentially be the cruelest game of 4D chess ever played by Sony and Namco, Ridge Racer 7 was released as a launch title for the PlayStation 3 in 2006, just 1 year after Ridge Racer 6 on Xbox. Now, fair enough, you might be thinking, until you boot the game up and realise it's literally just an overhauled version of Ridge Racer 6. The game looks brighter, more vibrant, it runs at a higher resolution, the art has been completely overhauled, yet it's still the same game. I have to respect the absolute audacity of Namco to give Xbox owners what was essentially a work-in-progress build of Ridge Racer 7 for the 360's launch. Madness. As a result of their similarities, many of the same criticisms still apply to Ridge Racer 7, with the exception of the colour palette. Whilst the layout of the game's tracks may still lack excitement, at least they look good this time around, retaining more of the vibrancy the series is known for. Outside of that, the campaign has been restructured into a more traditional race career through tournaments and leagues, but again with all of the same tracks, and all of the same cars. It's Ridge Racer 6+1. Stepping up to the plate then, we have Ridge Racer 7 running within RPCS3 on Steam Deck, and I have to say, the emulator hands in a very respectable showing given the circumstances. RPCS3 notoriously struggles on deck thanks to the machine's lack of cores and threads. Somehow, the game seems to just power through that issue and it runs at a decent enough frame rate. Ridge Racer 7 actually suffered a regression a number of years ago within RPCS3 and had its compatibility downgraded from playable back to in-game. The game would desync and crash when performing certain actions like scrolling through the list of vehicles you can choose for each race. I myself have run foul of this problem in the past, and it's the main reason that I haven't been able to emulate the game on any of my machines. I mention this because, well, I haven't been able to get the game to crash on deck. Whether this issue has been fixed inadvertently or not I don't know, but it looks as though we're in the clear. With that problem squared away, we're left with the typical drawbacks of RPCS3, with significant shader compilation stutter being one of them. Your first couple of laps on any given track will animate like Chicken Little, as the APU in your deck sweats to get shaders squared away on your drive. Audio too has its issues, with a distinct crackle accompanying just about every second I spent with Ridge Racer 7. Problems aside, I have to say I'm impressed with how the game runs on deck, and I'd nearly go as far as calling it playable. Ridge Racer 7 scores a compatibility rating of 6 out of 10 on Steam Deck. Following on from 1.5 home console titles and 1.25 PSP games, what do you think Namco's next move was? If you guessed patchy slot games, then you're right. In 2008, Namco teamed up with Japanese amusement firm Yamasa to develop 2 separate Ridge Racer patchy slot games for the arcade, with the first game in that series receiving a port to the PS2. It's entirely in Japanese, looks terrible, and it's a slot machine. Does anyone need any more information? I didn't think so. Look, the arcade games are a bust, we have no way of playing those, but here's the PS2 version of the first game running within PCSX2 if you're curious. The game features crackling audio and these black bars running vertically down the screen, as if the emulator wants to simulate playing patchy slot from inside a jail cell. I didn't play this for very long, I don't like seeing this being done to franchises I like. Aside from the 2 problems I mentioned, it seems to run fine. For that, it gets a 7 out of 10 for compatibility on deck. Get this shit out of here. One year after the patchy slot disaster, Namco opted to go down the money for old rope route, releasing Ridge Racer Accelerated for iOS and Android devices in 2009. The game repackages courses and cars from Ridge Racer PSP, downgrades their graphics, and splits them all out into separate microtransactions. Hey, why are you leaving? Is this not good? Thanks to the game's exclusive presence on mobile devices from the late noughties, I have no way of playing this one on deck. So they both get a 0 out of 10 for compatibility. Now get this shit out of here.
Ridge Racer.
In a slight course correction for the series, the next Ridge Racer game we would see was Ridge Racer 3D, released as a launch title for Nintendo's 3DS in 2011. At the time of its release, the game was widely praised by critics as being one of the best launch titles available for the system. Some criticised the game for looking worse than the PSP games that preceded it, however, and I'd be inclined to agree on that. Revisiting it nowadays is a relatively pleasurable experience. The game runs at 30 frames per second, which is a big step down from the PSP games, which ran at 60. The courses you whip around are mostly made up of older tracks from Ridge Racer 6+1 and Ridge Racer 2 1/3 on the PSP. 3 of them are new, however. Outside of that, it's business as usual for the series. Assessing the game on Steam Deck, and we get an accurate, albeit average, experience overall. Ridge Racer 3D really doesn't look that great to begin with, and upscaling the game's visuals to the deck's screen only really serves to highlight its shortcomings. Audio is basically perfect, no issues there. The game's frame rate, however, is very unstable on deck. The absence of Ridge Racer 3D's headline feature, 3D, is no doubt making the game we're left with look pretty tame compared to the series' greats. The middling emulation performance on deck detracts even further from the experience and lands the game with a compatibility score of 6 out of 10 on deck.
Slide through the curves.
Boy oh boy, this little gem ruffled some feathers. In 2012, Namco submitted their final entry into the franchise's rich pantheon of console launch titles, with Ridge Racer for the PS Vita. Released alongside the console itself, the game featured a whopping 5 different vehicles to drive, just 3 racetracks, all of which came from Ridge Racer 7, and no dedicated single-player campaign. Additional content for this impoverished husk of a game was split up into separate packs for you to purchase from the PlayStation Network. Oh goody! The only thing worse than seeing a series you love warped and mangled to fit the trends of the day is looking back on missteps like this years later, once those trends have expired. It's only then that you can really truly see these cash grabs for what they are: asinine, soulless lumps of software. Even worse, the game fails on a technical level too, running at only 30 frames per second. Comparing Ridge Racer on the Vita to its home console counterparts makes the older PSP games look like Herculean feats of software engineering. Those older games are phenomenal, this one is not. Not sure if this is a relief or not, but I could not get this game up and running on my Steam Deck, no matter how hard I tried. I used a bunch of different dumps of the game, and I couldn't get any of them to install in Vita 3K, which is an experimental new PS Vita emulator that's bundled in with emudeck. For that paltry display, the game gets a compatibility rating of 0 out of 10 on Steam Deck. Launching just 1 month after Ridge Racer on the Vita, Namco's next certified funny moment came in the form of Ridge Racer Unbounded. Sadly, this would end up being the final Ridge Racer game released for home consoles. Instead of making it themselves, Namco enlisted Bugbear Interactive, who up until that point had made the Flatout games and the PSP version of Sega Rally. Hey, no disrespect to Bugbear, by the way. That studio went on to develop Wreckfest immediately after wrapping up this game. They were and are a developer with real pedigree in the racing scene. It would have been great to see them operate within the well-established stylistic confines of the Ridge Racer series, but they just kind of went off in an entirely different direction with Unbounded. The slick, refined and understated aesthetic of the earlier games was supplanted with a mix between Split Second and Burnout. Forget drifting, you now had to focus on taking down opponents by boosting into them. This is an act the game rather unpleasantly calls fragging. You also use your boost to smash through sections of the environment and unlock shortcuts that marginally change the layout of the tracks you race on. Actually, speaking of which, why does this entire game look like a mod for Saints Row 3? Each course you drive on feels like a minor variant of either an American industrial backstreet or a freeway. Looking at the franchise's storied history when it comes to track design, maybe even just reading the room when it comes to the series itself, would have scored Namco and Bugbear some much needed brownie points here. Edge magazine gave Ridge Racer and Unbounded a 9 back in the day. A 9! I'd be more inclined to agree with Game Informer's impression of the game, which they likened to driving into a wall at full speed. Attempting to play the Xbox 360 version of the game via Xenia, and we get treated to a black screen with audio. I managed to muscle memory my way into a race in this one, and all I could see was the health bar on my opponent's vehicles. Did I mention the cars have health bars now? Ridge Racer Unbounded's simulation of being legally blind nets at a compatibility score of 1 out of 10 on Steam Deck. Switching over to the PS3 version of the game running within RPCS3, and we're even more unlucky. This time we get Steam's logo, just spinning around. That's it. Again, I should be disappointed, but I'm not. The PS3 port of Ridge Racer Unbounded scores a blindingly accomplished 0 out of 10 for compatibility on deck. Look, if you're absolutely desperate to play Ridge Racer Unbounded, it's the PC version you'll want to install. Running via Proton, the game offers excellent compatibility on deck. I did notice certain lighting effects look quite shimmery once I blew the game footage up to my PC monitor. Playing on the deck's own screen though, and the game looks appropriately punchy. I encountered no issues with performance either, and let me tell you, after this episode, that's a relief, even if the game itself is rubbish. Minor graphical blemishes aside, Ridge Racer Unbounded's PC port scores a perfect 10 out of 10 for compatibility on Steam Deck, and I don't like that. Having tested each and every version of Ridge Racer Unbounded on Steam Deck, I can assure you that I never want to play this game ever again. Its non-committal blend of every other arcade racer is a poor interpretation of Ridge Racer's core tenets. Anyway, let's forget about it. Here are this round's scores as a refresher, and the PC version takes the victory. The PC couldn't be here to accept its award today, however it has asked us to thank both Shader Compilation Stutter and Bottlenecks on its behalf. Wonderful business. Bandai Namco's next two attempts at wringing cash from the Ridge Racer IP would see the game arrive on mobile with two separate titles, Ridge Racer Slipstream and Ridge Racer Draw and Drift. Released for iOS and Android, each game imbued the franchise's racing action with fleetingly novel, mobile-specific mechanics that aren't terribly interesting or engaging. I know I've joked about this before on the show, but I do have to stress that it isn't my intention to close out these episodes in such a miserable way. It's a sad fact of the games industry that franchises routinely outstay their welcome in very unwelcome ways. Maybe one day we'll get to look at a franchise that burned bright and then left us wanting more. Today isn't that day, however. Given that all of these games were released on iOS and Android, there isn't currently an effective way to play them on Steam Deck. Both Ridge Racer Slipstream and Ridge Racer Draw and Drift score a compatibility rating of 0 out of 10 on Steam Deck. And that's a wrap! Every single port of every single Ridge Racer game has been reviewed and tested on Steam Deck. Thank you very much for joining me once again. As a reminder, be sure to leave a suggestion below on any franchise you'd like to see me test next. Tune in next week where I'll be testing a series of games that rhymes with Titerfan. See ya!